Good evening or good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen here. So, it's a pleasure for me to give this talk. I hope you can hear me and see my screen.
You're audible perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So greetings from India. And very glad to be able to participate in this workshop. I do want to also say that although in-person meetings are of course great, but I think it's nice to be able to do conferences both virtually, virtually at least some of the time, because it allows for a much more diverse kind of participation as we're seeing today. So thank you for inviting me here, and looking forward to the rest of the workshop. So I'm going to be talking about this topic: how does the brain solve CAPTCHAs? I think I don't need to tell any of you what CAPTCHAs are, and the fact that they still remain. These are tests that I use even today on many websites to sort of authenticate ourselves as human. And so especially when you're making important transactions like financial ones, or logging into making some important transactions on the internet, you're usually asked to confirm that you're human. And this is one of the classic tests. And it always surprises me, because even though computers defeat us in all kinds of other complex calculations, for example, they don't do too well at recognizing distorted letters. And the question has always puzzled me: what is the brain doing special, or what's the special thing that the brain is doing here? So I want to start by pointing out that this is not a new problem. This is a problem that was actually originally pointed out by Douglas Hofstadter. And he called it the two hard problems of AI. And this is just, of course, partly in humor. And he said, well, what is A? And then the second question is, of course, what is I? And coming from India, I can tell you that the second question is not really relevant. There is no self, so there is no I. And so really what we're left with is the question of what is A. And here Douglas Hofstadter was actually right, and he actually talks about this very interesting idea where this is actually just literally a figure from his book Metamagical Themas. And what he points out here is that all of us look at all of these variations of the letter A and have no trouble recognizing that these are all the letter A, even though, for example, some particular variations of A we might have never seen before. But we still seem to understand this concept of A-ness. And somehow it is these variations that sort of fool computer vision algorithms. But we don't seem to be fazed by these variations. So the question is, how is our brain actually solving this task, or what kind of features is the brain actually using to understand letters, or for that matter, any objects that you're looking at? And so if you look at how the brain solves vision, here's like every good neuroscientist have taken the brain out of the body. And this is actually a monkey brain with all the visual areas marked out. The eyes are on the front, on the left out here, and then the visual information goes to the primary visual cortex, which is shown here as V1. And then there's a series of areas which are involved in visual processing. And one of the dramatic things that you can notice here is that a very large fraction of the monkey brain is involved in processing vision. And in particular, there's the so-called ventral stream, which is involved in object recognition. We know this because if you lesion this area, this region called IT, the inferior temporal cortex, or this entire region, then animals can actually experience severe deficits in recognition. We also know that damage to these parts of the equivalent parts in the human brain also leads to visual agnosias, or disorders of recognition. And so because of this, we know that this region is crucial for recognition. Yeah. And so how do we actually understand how the brain is actually solving vision? Well, a classic way of actually doing this is to take these animals. Monkeys are known to have visual systems very similar to ours. And in this case, in our experiments, the monkeys are observing just a series of visual images, and they're getting juice for just looking. They're not doing any recognition task. And while they're doing this, and here's the brain back in the body, where it belongs. And while the animal is actually performing a task, we insert very thin microelectrodes into the brain, and we're recording electrical signals from individual neurons. And on a good day of recording, you will see a signal like this. And of course, on a bad day, I won't tell you what they look like. What I'm going to show you now is a recreation of a recording that we've done in our lab, where you're going to see what the animal saw. And then you're going to hear over the speakers. If I hope that sound will just come through without a problem. What you're going to hear over the speakers is the activity of a single neuron in IT in response to these images. And so you're going to hear bursts of activity like and those are going to be bursts of action potentials produced by these neurons. Okay, and please let me know if the sound doesn't come through. And so here's the video. So you're going to see what the animal saw, and hopefully, if this works, you're going to. Is that working?
Yeah, it's working.
So what's very interesting about this demo is that you would have heard the neuron respond to lots of objects, but also very interestingly, the neuron responds to multiple views, or it responds almost similarly to 2 views of each object. And this kind of invariance to viewpoint is very characteristic of neurons of this in this region. And so when you come to think about how is the brain actually reading distorted letters, well, our sort of hypothesis here was that if the brain is actually reading distorted letters so well because it's already good at handling distortions, which are experienced by the brain when it's looking at different viewpoints of the same object. So for example, when you look at 2 viewpoints of the same object, certain features are getting compressed, certain features are coming into view, certain features are disappearing from view. So the brain is already good at handling distortions. And we think that maybe that's why the brain is actually able to read distorted letters. And so one way to test that sort of idea is to take monkeys, which to the best of our knowledge cannot read. We show them distorted letters and we simply look at how well you can decode CAPTCHAs using the activity in the monkey's brain. And so we're not actually asking the animals to do anything. We're simply taking the responses of this region in the brain, which is useful and important for recognition. And we're testing whether these neurons are already pre-equipped to actually decode CAPTCHAs. So that's the experiment. This is all work done by a postdoc in our lab, Harish Katti. And so let's get right into it. So we wanted to test some specific possibilities, and the specific possibilities are like this. Let's say that you had presented a string, let's say presented multiple strings at multiple possible distortions. So here I'm showing you 2 strings which are presented 2 possible distortions. So our hypothesis was maybe neurons will produce separable responses wherein you can explain the response to a particular string and at a particular distortion using some function of the string tuning and some function of the distortion tuning. And that function could be product of the 2 tunings or the sum of the 2 tunings. Of course, it's possible that neurons do not respond according to the sum or the product, but they show some kind of deviation by which they're responding to particular distortions or particular strings. So that's the other alternative. We also wondered how neurons would respond to combinations of letters, exactly what you would get in a CAPTCHA. So for example, you have this particular string, and we wondered whether these responses of neurons to these combinations of letters could be explained as a product or the sum of the responses to the individual letters. And so really what we're asking is, are these neurons showing separable encoding of various properties of these distorted letters? Okay, so let's go to the first question. How do neurons respond to distorted letters? And I'm actually showing you an example response of a neuron. The left side is the observed response of a particular neuron. And what we're doing here is that there are several letters being presented at 4 possible distortions and also multiple different retinal positions. And what I'm showing you on the right-hand side is actually the prediction of a model where we're assuming that the response to the letter at a particular shape at a particular position is a product of the tuning to individual letters, shapes, and distortions. And so if you look at the response of these neurons, I mean, the response, of course, looks pretty noisy for this cell. And what you can do is now to compare the split half or the response reliability of each neuron as a function of the model correlation. So what I'm showing you here is the responses of 2 models, a multiplicative model where the response of a particular letter at a particular distortion or a particular retinal position is the product of shape tuning, distortion tuning, position tuning, and so on, all these different properties. Or it could be a sum of those tunings. And what we see systematically across neurons is that the response to distorted letters is a product, but not the sum of the shape and distorted tuning. And so you might be wondering that the two models seem to be very, very close. And that's indeed always going to be the case, because the sum and product of two numbers are always going to be correlated. So there'll always be a subtle difference, but the subtle difference translates into a pretty significant change in the accuracy of letter decoding as shown here. So here the multiplicative model is doing better in terms of decoding the letter identity compared to the additive model. Okay. So then we have the next question: how do IT neurons respond to multiple letters? And here again, there's the same neuron. I'm showing you now the response of this neuron to 2-letter strings, 3-letter strings, 4-letter strings, and so on, all the way up to 6-letter strings, the typical length that you see for CAPTCHAs. And again, we're looking at the same string at multiple possible distortions. And here's the prediction of a model. And here it turns out, very interestingly, that the response of the neuron to multiple letters is actually the sum, but not the product. And so now we're actually seeing the opposite kind of situation, where the response to letter strings is now the sum, but not the product of single letters. And so what we see is systematically emerging in this population of neurons that we've recorded is actually two very systematic rules. In one case, the response to distorted letters is a product, but not the sum of shape tuning and distortion tuning. In the second rule is that the response to multiple letters is a sum, but not the product of single letter responses. And so the question that we still were left wondering is, are these two rules sufficient to crack CAPTCHAs? And so what I mean by this is that, of course, we tested whether these neurons were able to decode individual letters in a CAPTCHA, and we found that there was above chance decoding to a pretty good degree. Of course, if you have many more neurons of this kind, you will do better. But the question really was, maybe our decoding was actually dependent on those few exceptional neurons which were not encoding information according to these rules, but then were actually contributing very heavily to decoding. So to actually address that question, we set up a computational simulation where we encoded neurons, or we created artificial neurons exactly and only with these rules. And we then asked if neurons were encoding letters and distortions using these rules, then can they decode CAPTCHAs perfectly or not? And so that's the setup. And so what we do is we create neurons which have broad or sharp tuning for letter shape, position, and distortion. We can then combine the response to a particular shape, position, and distortion as the sum of the product. We can then also combine the response to multiple strings as the sum of the product. And finally, we have a step which is divisor normalization, where the response to the complete string could either be directly the sum of the product or divided or normalized in some particular way for string. And so this is an opportunity for us to test whether each of these particular rules and how each of these particular rules turning them on or off would actually affect CAPTCHA decoding. And so here's one sort of result. So for each of these bars represent the decoding accuracy for individual letters in CAPTCHAs. But now each bar represents a population of neurons which were created only with one particular rule. And so in this, so for example, what you can see here is all of these models are actually not decoding letter identity too well. And all of these actually involve multiplicative encoding of strings. That is, the response of letter strings is actually the product of the response to letters. By contrast, if you look at models where you have additive encoding of strings, exactly like what you see in the brain, what we then see is much better decoding accuracy. And in particular, we see much better decoding accuracy for these bars which are labeled as M, which refers to multiplicative encoding of distortions. So basically what's happening here is that if you take neurons which are encoding distortions and letter shape in a multiplicative fashion, and then multiple letters in an additive fashion, those are exactly the population of neurons that give you almost perfect CAPTCHA decoding. And so what this is actually telling us is that these two rules are indeed sufficient to crack CAPTCHAs. And so then, of course, the natural next question is, are these two rules are actually naturally emerging in deep networks? So to answer that question, we took deep networks which were trained for either object recognition or text recognition in natural scenes. And here's the results. So here I'm looking at response of neurons to single characters across shape, position, distortions, or even looking at multiple letter strings across shapes and distortions. And at the bottom, I'm testing 4 possible pre-trained networks trained for either object recognition. So here it's ImageNet, or then there are 3 networks which are trained for text recognition in natural scenes. And what you can see in each of these cases is that each of these networks is actually encoding distortions and shapes in a multiplicative fashion. Okay, if you look at the same networks for their ability to encode multiple letters, And here you see additive decoding. And what you can see here is that all of these networks, the additive model is actually doing better. So we're subjecting these networks to exactly the same analysis that we've done for the real brain. And finally, if you look at their ability to decode CAPTCHAs, what you can see is that the best network here is DictNet. And DictNet actually was trained on text recognition for complete words in scenes. And it turns out that this particular network actually shows much better separability compared to the other networks. So we see a rough correlation where the networks that show more separable encoding of distorted letters are also showing better CAPTCHA decoding. And so to summarize what I've shown you so far, I've shown you that the brain uses a separable code for distorted letters. The separable code is sufficient for perfect CAPTCHA decoding, and the same separability emerges in deep networks trained for recognition. And I'm going to pause here for a few questions. I know I have a little bit more time. And if there's time, I'll go into telling you about another study that we've done comparing brains and deep networks. So I guess, Hirak, if you can tell me if I can, shall I go ahead, or perhaps there are questions about what I've said so far?
Do you think there's a difference, this is Jeff, between humans and monkeys with this task? With the humans, you kind of know what the task is, where the monkeys, they're passively viewing. Is that correct?
That's right. So what we
there's
think
something
is,
gained by the human knowledge that you think is missing?
So we've done other studies where we've actually looked at letter and text, larger, longer string representations in humans. And it turns out that we can explain a large part of how we read whole words or even jumbled words using this kind of separable encoding. And secondly, we've also looked at comparing letter and word representations in readers versus non-readers of a particular language. And there what we see is that readers actually show more separable encoding than non-readers. And so all of these seem to be going in the same direction, which is suggesting that that in fact the effect of learning to read or perhaps learning to recognize objects is to be able to generate separable representations. I don't know if that's addressing what you
Yeah, it starts to, yeah, thank you.
So for the tuning for the distortions, are they generic for another alphabet too, like learning English versus a different language? Like the distortions can be similar in two different alphabets. So the separable tuning for the distortion, could that be the same?
So we haven't actually checked systematically, but we've done other studies where we looked at neural responses in this region in the brain to natural objects, which are varying in viewpoint or size or retinal position and so on. And in all those cases, we see separable encoding. But we haven't actually looked for other scripts because largely the CAPTCHAs are typically written in English letters. And so we haven't really tested other distortions of other scripts. Yeah, might be interesting to do actually, especially for deep networks which are trained for a particular kind of text recognition. I wonder if if you see separability for other scripts which they're actually not trained on. So I may have a bit more time. So can I go ahead and maybe talk about another study that we've done related to encoding of, comparing vision in brains and deep networks?
Yeah, I think if there is no question, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is the question that we wanted to address in another study, and I kept it aside thinking I'll present it if I have more time. And the question that we wanted to address in the study was to compare visual processing in deep networks with what happens in the brain, but with a particular kind of approach, which wanting to compare quantitative versus qualitative differences. What I mean by this is that, for example, if you take humans on a particular object recognition task, and you take deep networks on the same kind of recognition task, you will see a quantitative difference in their performance. And then you can say, well, maybe the deep networks need to be trained better, or perhaps humans need to do better, and so on. And there's always going to be a quantitative difference. But what we wanted to actually look at is what could be a qualitative difference. In other words, is there something where are there cases where deep networks actually do something completely opposite to what humans do? So to answer this particular question, this is work done by Georgian, Harish, and Pramod, who are all in the lab, and now only Georgian remains. And so the question that we wanted to address here is, can we take classic sort of phenomena in psychology and then check whether we can observe the same phenomena in deep networks as well? So one classic phenomenon, of course, is the Thatcher effect. Here, what you're seeing here is that these two faces look very, very different when they're upright. And when you invert them, they of course look completely, they look very, very similar. And what this means is that if you look at the distance between these two faces in the upright orientation, the distance is actually much larger than in the inverted orientation. And this is a great demonstration of how you can preserve all the image features, but then still find a very qualitative difference between the processing of upright versus inverted faces. And so really what we realized is that a lot of these phenomena in psychology, which have been reported in vision and perception, can be cast as comparisons of distance in some underlying perceptual space. And so if you look at Thatcher effect, which is what is shown here, the upright face distance between these two upright faces is actually larger than the inverted distance. And so armed with this particular idea, we can actually then say, do deep networks actually show the Thatcher effect? And so the simple question here is, can we compare the distance between two upright faces and the distance between two inverted faces? And then again, a very common approach used in neuroscience is to convert this into a single index. And so here the Thatcher index is actually just this difference divided by the sum. And this difference will be positive for humans. And so that shows that they have the Thatcher effect. Now you can do the same exact thing for every layer in a deep network. And you can compute the distance between the upright faces and the inverted faces and calculate this index. And we saw something very interesting. And so here's the plot of this Thatcher index across layers for a couple of different deep networks. And so first of all, for humans, it's always going to be above 0. But if you look at what's happening for the VGG16, which is trained on object recognition, you see sort of a temporary sort of emergence of the Thatcher index, but again, nothing in the later layers which are important or used by the classifier layer. But then if you look at the same thing for the face trained network, you do see a very clear Thatcher. And of course, that's in a way interesting, but not too surprising, because these face trained networks are actually trained for upright faces. But something very interesting happened when we looked at other sorts of phenomena. And here's one example that is very striking. There is a phenomenon known as the global advantage. And here what happens is humans actually can report, if you look at a shape like this, they can report the global shape faster than the local shape. And there's a classic phenomenon in psychology. And now it's commonly known as by the saying that we see the forest before we see the trees. And so this is the basic idea. And if you think about it, this is actually again a sort of it captures a particular kind of arrangement in perception. And what we think is happening is that humans are actually very sensitive to the change in the global structure or the global shape. And they're not very sensitive to change in the local structure or the local shape. And so again, we can say humans must be actually having a much bigger difference between two shapes which have the same local elements, but a difference in the global structure. Whereas not a very big difference in perception between two shapes which have the same global structure, but a different local structure. And so then we can again capture this whole idea using an index. And we can compute the distance, the average distance between two shapes differing at the global level, and compare that with the same two shapes differing at the local level. And if you plot this global advantage index across layers of deep networks, what we actually see is something quite striking, which is that these networks actually show a local advantage, and a very massive local advantage compared to what you see in humans. So remember, always in all these analyses, we actually take a positive index to be similar to humans. And so this is what I mean by a qualitative difference, because here deep networks are actually showing a completely opposite effect. And it's not an effect which is in the same direction as humans, like we saw earlier with the Thatcher effect. But here it's a qualitative difference between deep networks and humans in the way they represent these global and local information. And actually, if you look at we did a bunch of these comparisons, and what we find is a table of properties where we see whether each of these properties are present in deep networks or not. And so then we get a list of properties where deep networks differ from humans in a qualitative sense, whereas there are other properties where the deep networks do perform or show similar effects as humans. So to summarize what I've shown you so far, in study 1, which was the main topic of my talk, I showed you that the brain uses a separable code to crack CAPTCHAs. And in study 2, I've shown you that brains and deep networks actually show both qualitative similarities and differences. So I'll stop there. This is, sorry about that. So I'll stop there, and I will thank all the people in our lab at the moment. And if you're interested, please do get in touch. And these are all the funding agencies that pay us to do what we love to do. Thank you.
Is there any questions from the audience?
I'll ask a question. It's sort of a general question. So this is really interesting, especially the findings with both studies, that there's some things that deep neural networks seem to have similar, especially maybe the early processing, and some that there's differences. Can you think of ways that maybe we could resolve in the deep networks some of these differences? You know, what's missing, do you think?
Well, so as far as the global advantage effect goes, what we have observed and we're still trying to figure out is there a different way to train the networks so that they actually acquire a global advantage? And so either you could impose it as a constraint during training, or maybe it's the nature of the training itself. For example, the ImageNet database actually has 100 or hundreds of categories of dogs. And that could be biasing the networks during training to pick up very fine differences between dogs and perhaps then acquire a local advantage. And these are things that we're actually trying to test out.
I'm also wondering if there's something architecturally that's
right. So again, so actually, if you look at the randomly initialized deep network architecture, like say, for example, the very popular BGG16 architecture, what we actually see is that there is a global advantage. And in the untrained network, whereas if you train it and you look at the, if you look at the trained network, typically you see a local advantage. And this is actually, by the way, not true just of BGG16, but we've actually tested now many different neural network architectures, including recurrent architectures, and including those trained on other data sets as well. So it seems to be a fairly, it seems to be common across all these architectures. So either we're missing something in terms of the training or the architecture. I'm not an expert in deep networks, so I'm not quite sure what is missing. Yeah.
Well, that's actually an interesting insight. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.